In a matter of minutes, the unthinkable happened. Tehran, a capital that had stood beyond the reach of direct attack for decades, was struck with surgical precision. Multiple explosions erupted across the city as military command centers, air defense installations, and critical infrastructure were hit simultaneously. The coordination was absolute. The speed, overwhelming. Iran's defensive systems, designed to protect the regime's nerve center, were rendered useless. Communications networks went dark across key facilities. Senior military commanders were reportedly killed in the strikes, and in an extraordinary admission of vulnerability, the supreme leader was rushed to an underground bunker hidden from a threat that had penetrated the very heart of the Islamic Republic. This wasn't just another exchange in a regional conflict. This was a demonstration of reach, capability, and intent that has left Iran's leadership facing an impossible calculation and the entire Middle East on edge. To understand this moment, you have to trace the escalatory spiral that made it inevitable. For months, the region has been locked in a cycle of attack and retaliation that kept edging closer to direct confrontation. Iran's network of proxy forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias in Iraq and Syria had stepped up operations against Israeli and American targets, drone strikes, rocket barrages, attacks on shipping lanes in the Red Sea, each action designed to apply pressure without crossing the threshold into open war. But that threshold kept shifting. Israel responded with strikes on Iranian assets in Syria. The United States reinforced its military presence in the Gulf. Intelligence sharing between Washington and Tel Aviv intensified. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and foreign policy analysts at the Atlantic Council, what changed in recent weeks was the targeting of senior Israeli military officials and a particularly devastating attack on civilian infrastructure that killed dozens. The calculus shifted. Deterrence through restraint had failed. And so the decision was made not to send another warning shot, but to deliver a message that could not be misunderstood. The operation began just after midnight local time. Initial reports, corroborated by satellite imagery analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War, indicate that the first wave targeted Iran's integrated air defense network surrounding Tehran. S-300 missile batteries, Russia's most advanced systems exported to Iran, were disabled. Within the opening minutes, radar installations went offline. This created what military analysts call air superiority, a corridor of vulnerability through which subsequent waves could operate with impunity. The second phase hit military command and control centers in the northern districts of the capital, facilities that housed senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders responsible for coordinating proxy operations across the region. Explosions were reported at the Parchin military complex, long suspected of housing missile development programs. Communications infrastructure, specifically military-grade fiber optic networks and satellite uplink facilities, were struck, creating a blackout that prevented coordinated response. Iranian state media initially remained silent, an information vacuum that lasted nearly 2 hours. When acknowledgement finally came, it was carefully worded, admitting to defensive operations against airspace violations, but providing no casualty figures, no damage assessments. But social media told a different story. Videos posted from Tehran showed massive fireballs lighting up the night sky. The sound of secondary explosions echoed across residential neighborhoods, and perhaps most telling, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was confirmed by Iranian sources to have been relocated to a fortified underground command center, a protocol reserved for existential threats. What made this strike unprecedented wasn't just the scale, it was the location. Tehran has been considered functionally untouchable for decades. Iran's entire defensive posture has been built on the principle of concentric rings of protection, with the capital at the center of multiple layers of air defense, early warning systems, and rapid response capabilities. Previous Israeli operations targeted Iranian assets in Syria, Iraq, even inside Iran itself, but always at the periphery. Nuclear facilities at Natanz, military installations near the Iraqi border, never the capital, never the command structure. According to Michael Knights, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, this required not just advanced weaponry, but extraordinarily detailed intelligence, the kind that comes from penetration of Iran's security apparatus at multiple levels. The aircraft or missiles used would have needed to defeat Russian-made S-300 systems, navigate Iran's domestic Bava R-373 air defense network, and strike targets whose precise coordinates are among the Islamic Republic's most closely guarded secrets. The message was unmistakable: nowhere is safe, no target is beyond reach, and the assumption that Tehran itself represents a red line, a boundary that ensures regime survival, has been shattered for a government that derives much of its domestic legitimacy from the promise of security and resistance to foreign pressure. This is not just a military setback, it's a political crisis. Inside Iran, the psychological damage may exceed the physical destruction. The Islamic Republic's narrative to its population has always centered on strength, resilience, and the ability to deter aggression through a combination of military capability and strategic depth. The regime survived a brutal 8-year war with Iraq. It built a network of regional allies and proxy forces that extended Iranian influence from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Peninsula, and through it all, Tehran remained inviolate, a sanctuary protected by geography, technology, and deterrence. That myth died in a matter of minutes. Karim Sajidpour, an Iran analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, noted in recent commentary that authoritarian regimes are particularly vulnerable to demonstrations of impotence. The social contract is simple. Citizens accept restricted freedoms in exchange for security and order. When that security is revealed as illusory, the contract fractures. Already there are reports of internal recriminations within the Revolutionary Guard leadership. Questions about intelligence failures, demands for accountability, and looming over all of it is the impossible dilemma now facing Supreme Leader Khamenei and the security establishment: respond with force and risk a wider war that Iran cannot win and that could destabilize the regime itself, absorb the blow, and appear weak, inviting further attacks and emboldening domestic dissent. There is no good option, only choices between different kinds of damage. The ripple effects are already reshaping calculations across the region. In Beirut, Hezbollah leadership is facing pressure to respond on Iran's behalf, but doing so risks dragging Lebanon into a conflict that could be catastrophic for an already collapsing state. The group's military capabilities are significant, but direct confrontation with Israel would invite the kind of comprehensive retaliation that could destroy infrastructure Hezbollah relies on for both military operations and political control. In Yemen, the Houthis, who have been launching drone and missile attacks against Israeli territory and commercial shipping for months, are being urged by Iranian handlers to escalate, but they too face constraints. Their arsenal, while substantial, is dependent on Iranian resupply through routes that are now more vulnerable than ever. In Baghdad and Damascus, Iranian-backed militias are recalibrating. The strike on Tehran demonstrated that Iranian protection is not guaranteed, that association with the Islamic Republic might be a liability rather than an asset. Meanwhile, U.S. officials, speaking to reporters from Reuters and the New York Times, have made clear that American forces in the region are on heightened alert, prepared to respond to any attacks on personnel or interests. Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the way Qatar are engaging in frantic diplomatic back-channeling, trying to prevent a regional conflagration that would threaten their own stability and economic interests. And Israel, which has not officially confirmed involvement in the Tehran strikes, is watching closely to see whether deterrence has been restored or whether this is simply the beginning of a more dangerous phase. Iran's leadership now faces three broad paths, each with profound implications. The first is measured retaliation through proxy forces, Hezbollah strikes on northern Israel, Houthi attacks on shipping or U.S. bases, militia operations in Iraq and Syria. This allows Iran to respond without direct confrontation, preserving some degree of deniability and control over escalation, but it also risks appearing indirect, almost cowardly, and may not satisfy hardliners within the Revolutionary Guard who are demanding blood for blood. The second option is direct military response: ballistic missile strikes on Israeli territory, attacks on U.S. assets in the Gulf, or operations against critical infrastructure in neighboring states. This would demonstrate resolve and capability, but it would also invite devastating retaliation that Iran's conventional military is not equipped to withstand. The United States has made clear, through both public statements and private channels reported by Foreign Affairs magazine, that attacks on American forces would trigger a response targeting Iran's oil infrastructure, its navy, and potentially its nuclear facilities. The economic and military costs could be regime-threatening. The third path is strategic absorption, publicly downplaying the damage, quietly reshuffling security leadership, and focusing on internal consolidation while avoiding escalation. This is the path of survival, but it carries its own dangers. Appearing weak invites further aggression, it emboldens domestic opposition, and it risks fracturing the coalition of hardliners who have kept the Islamic Republic in power for more than 4 decades. Experts monitoring Iranian decision-making are watching for key indicators in the coming 72 hours: emergency meetings of the Supreme National Security Council, movements of missile units, communications from proxy groups, and most importantly, the public messaging from Khamenei himself. What happened in Tehran in a matter of minutes has set in motion a chain of events whose conclusion remains uncertain. The vulnerability exposed wasn't just technical or tactical, it was existential. For decades, the Islamic Republic built its regional strategy on the assumption that Tehran itself was beyond reach, that the costs of direct attack were too high, the risks too great. That assumption is gone, and with it, the fragile equilibrium that has governed Middle Eastern power dynamics for a generation. The choices Iran makes in the coming days will determine whether this was an isolated demonstration of capability or the opening move in a wider conflict that could engulf the region. Every regional actor, from Hezbollah commanders in southern Lebanon to American carrier groups in the Persian Gulf, is watching, calculating, preparing. The Middle East has seen devastating wars before, but this moment feels different, not because of the destruction already inflicted, but because of how quickly. The perception of power can shift, and how rapidly that shift can spiral into violence that no one fully controls. Tehran's shield has shattered. What comes next will be determined not by strategy alone, but by pride, fear, and the dangerous logic of escalation in a region where there are no safe bets and no easy exits.